Hi everybody. March ended on a strong note after experiencing a short mid-month correction. The trading activity was quite heavy, suggesting a new test again to reach all-time highs. The index actually closed plus 2%, just short of its all-time high, which was reached on the 9th of April 2018. Our portfolio of the AFC Vietnam Fund also had a fantastic month and was up plus 5.5% net. Valuation-wise, we're still much cheaper than the market, so we still trade at a great discount to market valuations. Hi, my name is Andreas Vogelsanger. I'm the CEO of the AFC Vietnam Fund. The index tested its old highs before retreating on profit taking. A breakout is in reach, but good things come to those who wait, as we all know. So here you have a picture of the index. You can see it tried to break out a few times, and now the question is obviously, will we soon now finally manage to break through? It has been roughly 3 years since the index reached its all-time high of 1,211.34, while in comparison the S&P 500 rose around 50% over the same period. So if you go back to end of 2017, Vietnam's GDP was around $223.8 billion. That compares with, at the end of 2020, of 269.5 billion. So that's an improvement of around 20%. But also company profits are much higher today than they were in 2017. And other economic indicators improved significantly as well. For example, if you look at total exports, they increased in that period 32%. And we generally think a breakout into uncharted territory seems to be just a question of time. At current valuations and with economic and profit dynamics continuously positive, we see tremendous further upside potential for the index in general, but also and especially for our portfolio, the AFC Vietnam Fund, has massive room to grow over the next few years. If we look at trading activity, what happened over the last few months, it's actually interesting to note that foreigners hardly participated in that rally, which we saw. We are currently in a bull market, so the markets is really are just fantastic and very active. But foreigners were net sellers over the last few months. So that's really interesting to see when finally they're coming back into the market and what will potentially trigger them to come back. But for an economy which obviously is booming, banks play a very important role. And we think the banking sector has tremendous upside potential. That's for several reasons. On one hand, 30% of the Vietnamese adults have a bank account, so only 30%. But the government made one of their top priorities is to improve or modernize the nation's payment industry. And therefore they're promoting e-commerce quite heavily. They're directing also banks to reduce the cash transactions. And they have a clear target that 70% of the Vietnamese above 15 years old should have a bank account within the very near future. And as you can see from this slide here, the banking sector actually is a huge sector. It's around 25.8% of the Vietnam index in terms of weighting. So it's the largest sector. If you look at profitability of Vietnamese banks, it's actually astonishing to see that in terms of ROE, return on equity, they have the highest return of equity if we compare them with other ASEAN markets such as the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia or Thailand. So they have a return on equity of around 18%, which is significantly higher than all the other banks. So arguably a higher ROE deserves actually a higher stock prices or a higher valuation. And that hasn't happened yet. So therefore we really think there's still some room to go. If you look at, for example, as I said, banks are important for an economy which is growing. And if we look at GDP growth over the last few years, we obviously saw in 2020 it collapsed that growth dramatically, but it still was positive, which is very rare if you compare that with other countries around the globe, which all had negative growth actually. And Vietnam was one of the few countries which still was positive. But more importantly now is to see what the growth will be in 2021. And the estimates vary between 7% plus to around 8.5%. So we're going to see a significant improvement of growth in Vietnam in 2028. 2021, of course. Maybe another important factor for the banks is that they were able to improve their net interest margin. If you look, for example, at over the last 12 months, what happened to the one-year deposit rates, they actually have fallen from around 10% to 5%. So a massive fall. And that helps the banks tremendously to actually improve their net interest margin, which is currently around 5.2%, which is quite a high number. Banks, normally how they define their lending rate, they take the cost of capital, they add on their fixed costs, and they add at least another 2% of margin, which is actually quite heavy. So therefore, actually these net interest margins helps the banks to be quite profitable. So, as I said, long-term outlook for Vietnamese banks looks really interesting, and given that, for example, as I mentioned before, that around 70% of the adult population still doesn't have a bank account. But additionally to that, only around 4% of the Vietnamese population, which is almost 100 million, has a credit card. So only 4% has a credit card. So, and what also is interesting that around 87% of the Vietnamese population has an age of under 54. So it's a very young population, and that gives tremendous upside potential for banks to obviously increase the bank account penetration or credit card penetration. So they have quite a lot of room to grow. So if you compare that, as I said, only around 30% has a bank account, but if you compare that with other ASEAN markets like Singapore, for example, almost the entire population has a bank account. But also Malaysia is pretty high, and Thailand is pretty high in terms of bank accounts. It's over 80% for these two countries. Then Indonesia, around half of the population has a bank account, and Philippines, only 34%. So, and what's also maybe interesting is the mobile usage. I prepared a slide here, so you can see the Vietnamese population actually spends around 3 hours on their mobile devices per day in terms of using that. And yeah, so I said banks are inexpensive. Also, if you look at PER, so price earnings ratio, if I compare that, first of all, just what the PERs are in general in the Vietnam index, as I said, it has the highest weighting, but the average PER is only 11 times compared to an index which has around 18 times PER. But if you look at other banking sectors in ASEAN, Indonesia stands out with a very high PER of 31 times, which is really, really expensive, one would argue. But the other countries in ASEAN are between 12 and 15 times. But if we look at Vietnam, so if we look at our portfolio, we have in the top 10 holdings, we hold 4 banks, and the average PR of these banks is 9.4 times. So, which is obviously even lower than the banking sector on average in Vietnam. So yes, that's all from me. Thank you very much for listening. You're going to hear from me again next month with the update of April. Thank you very much and goodbye.